All right. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm Samantha Fossart, the Executive Director of the Saratoga Springs Preservation Foundation. We are doing this in partnership with the City of Saratoga Springs, who was funded with a certified local government from the New York State's Office of Park, Recreation and Historic Preservation. This is the fifth and the final out of this educational series. We had 4 other programs since May, and actually April. And this is a topic that I think we're all interested in as Saratoga continues to change and grow. And so we thought it would be great to have people from another community that is doing infill design and see their approach and how they look at their buildings in their historic districts. So, without further ado, I will introduce Emily Ahouse, is the Zoning Administrator and Deputy Director of the Department of City Planning and Engagement for the City of Cincinnati, where she oversees the day-to-day operations for the city's Zoning Division and Historic Conservation Office. She also has been the Executive Director of the Walnut Hills Redevelopment Foundation, a CDC serving the historic Walnut Hills neighborhood, also in Cincinnati. I know actually Emily because we were classmates at Cornell at the Masters of Historic Preservation program. She actually finished. I did not complete my thesis, so congratulations. So I always have to clarify that. And so it's nice to have her return to come to Saratoga for the first time. Then Chad Burke, he's a principal and the mixed use market director for architecture firm GBBN, overseeing the firm's urban infill, multifamily, residential, nonprofit, and workplace project. Chad works closely with clients to design solutions that meet their short-term and long-term needs. His work includes University of Cincinnati's Digital Futures, Willkommen, Hill-Rom's Innovation Center, and Union Central Trust. And I learned tonight that he was involved with the wonderful restoration of the Union Station in Cincinnati, a stunning Art Deco train station. And if you ever go to Cincinnati, you must go see it. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to them.
Can everybody hear me without the microphone? So Emily and I are going to talk a little bit about just some of our experience and, this maybe interactive, so if there's questions and things, just kind of raise your hand. I don't think this needs to be too formal. But it's, Over-the-Rhine is a historic district in Cincinnati. We're going to talk a little bit about the process of those historic guidelines and an infill project that is in that district. So we're going to go through a little bit of a history of Over-the-Rhine, a little bit of a history of the historic guidelines and the evolution of the historic guidelines. We're going to talk specifically about the Willkommen project, which you just saw an image of, and then we have some time for some Q&A. So how many people have been to Cincinnati before? Hey, all right. How many people have been to Over-the-Rhine or heard of Over-the-Rhine? Okay. So Over-the-Rhine is kind of we were just talking, there's about 20 different historic districts in Cincinnati. Over-the-Rhine is kind of the crown jewel of our historic districts. It gets the most attention, and it's honestly the biggest economic generator of all the historic districts. It's a very important piece. You can kind of see an overview on the right side of what it looks like today. It's historically been a working class neighborhood over the years. But what's interesting about Over-the-Rhine, so our downtown, we're a river city, so the Ohio River comes right down through our downtown area, and then Over-the-Rhine is this kind of large footprint. So it's as big as our downtown area. The interesting thing about Cincinnati is when the expressway system and when urban renewal happened, we're a city that's kind of down in the river basin, and we're surrounded by hills. even down in here. This is Kentucky, by the way. So, I find people are surprised that Kentucky is right across the river from we are. So when urban renewal happened, it happened here. But we were really kind of protected. Over-the-Rhine was protected from downtown and the hillside. And so a lot of the historic fabric was kind of untouched, which at the time and over the years has been a problem. Now it is really the asset that is becoming an economic driver. How did it get named Over-the-Rhine? Cincinnati has a long kind of German history. There used to be a canal system. The canal connected Cincinnati all the way up to the Toledo and Lake Erie. And that canal, over time, wasn't used anymore. And so, actually, this is kind of a fun fact, Cincinnati in the early 20th century started vacating that canal and building a subway tunnel. And the subway tunnels are still intact, unused, unfinished, which is kind of one of our planning crimes that those never got completed. But the canal is what separated downtown area from the Over-the-Rhine neighborhood, and it was called the Rhineland Canal. That was the name of it. And all the German kind of heritage in the area, they would work downtown, and they would cross the canal to get back home. And the old saying goes they were going over the Rhine, and that's the name that stuck. And we like it. So this is kind of an interesting slide because while all this fabric was kind of preserved, in a majority of it, when the expressway system kind of got built to the left of it, since 1930, there has been a lot of deterioration of that historic fabric because there was no historic district in place. And I think that deterioration got to a point where we needed to do something about it, and that's a little bit of what Emily's going to talk about in terms of the implementation of the historic guidelines that were able to kind of save some of that fabric.
Yeah. And so you can see from these two comparisons that one of the opportunities of losing so much historic fabrics is that there were plenty of sites for infill in the neighborhood. So the city has, in recent years, had a lot of conversations about how to address that infill. And the project that Chad will go into more detail, Willkommen, it really fell right in the middle of a very long process of revising the Over-the-Rhine design guidelines. So that was a process that started in 2014 and ended with their final adoption in 2023. And Willkommen was going through the review process in 2019, right at the same time that the first draft of the guidelines was being presented. So taking a step back, Over-the-Rhine saw the traditional patterns of disinvestment many urban areas saw through the 60s. Population declined, but many of the buildings remained intact. By 2003, that was when the previous guidelines were adopted. The majority of the development that was happening was rehab. There wasn't a lot of infill happening. There was a resurgence starting, renewed interest in the neighborhood, but more rehab and redevelopment of existing buildings than investing in infill. So it was not a primary consideration when those last design guidelines were developed. 2005 was really when the neighborhood started to see its first major infill construction begin. And you can see this project on the screen. This is at a relatively prominent gateway site along the former site of the canal on Central Parkway. This project was ground floor retail, 25 residential condos and a parking garage. And from there, throughout the next decade, we saw more and more infill. Various forms, various scales, as you can see here, from row houses to larger scale, mixed-use, multifamily development. So much so that by 2014, the conversation was starting about needing to look more closely at the infill and the design guidelines for the city. It's important to note that this conversation wasn't initiated by the city. It was initiated by the Over-the-Rhine Foundation and their Infill Advisory Committee, but the city was at the table. And the city in 2017 applied for a certified local government grant to fund the completion of a draft of the design guidelines. So we were part of the process. We weren't the applicant or the project manager of the design guidelines update. And by 2017, we had seen almost $1 billion of investment in the neighborhood. We'd seen 100 residential condos developed. We'd seen 23,000 square feet of new retail. So we were seeing that infill was viable in the neighborhood and it was increasing. So we recognized that this was an important issue to resolve. But the goals for the project were really to provide more clarity in the design guidelines, to make them user-friendly, to make them graphically oriented, and to address areas where there was concern that the guidelines were too ambiguous. And you can see here, the previous guidelines for infill, 3 pages, simple narrative descriptions, no illustrations, nothing fancy, very simple, straightforward guidelines. And I think it's important to note, at least for the city's side, the design guidelines project wasn't necessarily initiated because we felt that we were getting bad design. Here's 4 very different projects in different parts of the neighborhood that were approved under the previous guidelines. Institutional buildings, mixed use, row houses, that we felt were meeting that goal of contemporary but compatible. And really our goal was to make it more user-friendly, more graphically oriented, and provide more clarity. Over the next 2 years, before the first draft was published, I think it's fair to say that somewhere in there we lost a little bit of that goal to make them more user-friendly as we went from a 3-page document to over 60 pages of guidelines in that first draft. So when we got the first draft of the guidelines in 2019, there were concerns expressed. Those were expressed by city staff, those were expressed by design professionals, developers, other neighborhood stakeholders, and they really fell in 5 primary buckets when we looked at this first draft. They were too prescriptive and formulaic, the way height was addressed, the extensive use of must instead of should in the language, how storefronts were addressed, and how modern features were addressed by the guidelines. And I'm just going to walk you through sort of what the issues were in that first draft. When we look at being too prescriptive, these guidelines use the word median a lot. There were a lot of calculations needed to even understand what your massing could be. So if you look, one of these, building width should be consistent with the median building width of non-monumental contributing buildings located within the same block phase. So if you have a vacant site, before you can even start to wrap your head around the concept of what massing is appropriate, you would need to survey that whole block, figure out what's contributing, what's not contributing, what's considered monumental or non-monumental, and then do the calculation. So it was overly burdensome, to start the process, and I think it was well intended. The idea was to quantify what compatible is, but I think that's a hard thing to make a formula to get the right outcome for. The same issue was really the principal issue with the way height was regulated. You can see here a lot of words all related to height, different regulations for the primary facade height and the secondary facade height, different treatment for corner buildings, different streets excluded from the height requirements and permitting more height. Again, extensive calculations that needed to happen to really figure out what height was appropriate. One of the principal issues that staff had with the first iteration of the guidelines was I wish I had a count of just the number of times the word must was used. And from our interpretation, anytime it says must, there's really no flexibility. No ability for staff to say, you know what, this is contextually appropriate, even though it doesn't necessarily meet the letter of what the guidelines say you should do. You must do this on any site in the city, no matter what the context is. And for a city that has, professional staff that's making recommendations to the board every week, Working with the developers in advance, we felt that that was really taking the creativity out of the design and taking the ability to evaluate projects on a case-by-case basis out of the process. Storefronts, again, this was a similar issue, a lot of use of median, a lot of very specific measurements, 2 inches to 4 inches of the glass being inset, 18 inches sill height. Again, very formulaic, not really allowing for a contextual review of the block and developing your design from there. One of the things that we were seeing in infill design as people were moving back to the downtown urban setting is that residents wanted features that were not part of the historic landscape. They wanted roof decks and balconies in your dense urban setting, have some outdoor space. They wanted a place to park their car off street, and they wanted a vehicular entrance. The initial draft of the design guidelines, again, had a lot of musts that really left no ability to design these features in a context-sensitive manner. It was very prescriptive. For example, a roof deck was not permitted to have any access beyond the minimal stair tower or elevator shaft needed to access the stair tower. So it didn't acknowledge the potential that you could have a bigger room or space to access the roof decks that could be entirely not visible from any vantage points from the streetscape or from farther away. So it's not all doom and gloom. We resolved the issues. It was a longer process. This draft was presented, as I said, in 2019. Our process is that the Historic Conservation Board reviews the guidelines. They make a recommendation to the City Planning Commission. Planning Commission makes a recommendation to City Council. They ultimately adopt the legislation. The Historic Conservation Board review was a year after the initial draft was submitted. We worked through some of the issues. The Historic Conservation Board generally was supportive without resolution of all these issues, but they said you need to work on height more before it goes to Planning Commission. Went to Planning Commission the next month. Planning Commission tabled the whole project and said, really, you need to address all 5 of these items, not just height, but you really need to work, do more engagement with professional stakeholders, with developers, with people that are working and living in the neighborhood. So that paused the project for about 2 years, and those were COVID years, so it was, part of the timeline there is probably that it was harder to do that engagement and work through those revisions, but it was also that they were complicated issues to try and resolve. So finally, September of 2022, the guidelines came back to Planning Commission. All of these issues hadn't necessarily been fully resolved, but staff had some recommended edits to resolve what hadn't been resolved. Planning Commission approved them, but said, we want to see a clean version of this document with all of these edits in it. That, because it's such a graphic document, that took a while to get through. April of 2023, the Planning Commission reviewed and approved the guidelines. The next month, our City Council approved them. And how did we resolve these issues? In terms of being prescriptive and formulaic, we really took out those calculations. Like I said, I think they were well-intentioned, but not really user-friendly for either staff or applicants. You can see here in height, you saw the extensive text in the first draft. We really kind of decided on this particular element, not only did we take out the median, we said what was in the current guidelines wasn't broken. So we didn't feel that there was a need to change. We carried that over. Height of new construction should not vary more than 1 story from the adjacent contributing building. Something very intuitive, simple, easy to understand. In terms of the use of must versus should, we removed almost all of the use of the word must. Again, because we felt that we have professionals donating their time to serve on the board. We have professional staff evaluating projects. We wanted more flexibility to make those context-sensitive decisions and not have a lot of things that were outlined that you must do on every site in the city without reviewing the context. There was one place where we felt that it was appropriate to keep the must in, and I think this is the only place potentially that it stayed, and that was that windows, when you have replacement windows, they must not have internal only grids. We did acknowledge there's no scenario in the city that we would want to permit that, no matter what the context is. So I think that's the one place where it must stay. Storefronts, we did keep pretty extensive, pretty detailed guidelines for storefronts because we acknowledge that they're an important element, but we took out those very precise calculations, the 2 inches, the 4 inches, the 18 inches, the median calculations of other storefronts. So again, to give guidance, but not a specific formula you had to meet no matter what. And in terms of balconies, roof decks, and vehicular entrances, I think that this was kind of one of those compromise situations where none of the stakeholders or interested parties were super happy, so it was a good compromise. This is one where we kept in a lot of detail, but we removed the musts. So we felt that there was a good level of guidance on what was generally appropriate, but gave some flexibility for, again, reviewing the specific context of a site and making a determination that maybe may or may not be exactly the letter of the guideline. And so as we went through that 9-year process, trying to think on the lessons that we learned from a very long process, overall, I think the biggest thing we learned was to make sure you set clear goals from the beginning, goals for the document overall, goals for how you want to treat modern features in the district. Do you want to permit them? Do you want to be significantly restrictive of their introduction? And goals for how flexible versus how prescriptive you want the guidelines to be. I think even when we got to that last Planning Commission submittal, there were some fundamental disagreements between the applicants and staff and the stakeholders on these items that if we had hashed this discussion out at the beginning of the process, it really would have saved us a lot of time and energy and discussion throughout the process. Once you've developed those goals, I would, again, recommend that they be monitored throughout the process, especially if it's a long 9-year process. As I said, we did still wind up with a over 60-page document, so somewhere in there, that idea for being clear and user-friendly got a little bit lost in translation because of that. Include developers and design professionals throughout the process. I think, I want to be fair, there were a lot of developers and design professionals on the Infill committee, but there were also a lot of developers and design professionals doing work in the neighborhood that didn't see the recommendations till that first draft came up and had significant concerns. So making sure you're reaching all of the stakeholders. And then the final lesson is really just the length of the document and making it user-friendly. Even as I was going back to prepare for this, I was thinking, we really need a Cliff Notes version. And that's something, it is a beautiful document. It has a lot of illustrations. It has a lot of explanation. But for a design professional that wants to just flip to roof decks and see what they need to do, it's a cumbersome document. For staff, it has exponentially increased the length of our staff reports. We write a report with recommendations for each case that goes before our Historic Conservation Board, and we write out item by item how the project meets or doesn't meet the guidelines. So we're looking at probably a typical 16 to 20-page staff report now, and I don't know that our board members love that extra length, which is probably 2 to 3 times the average staff report before when we were going through simple guidelines. So I'll turn it over to Jeff.
We do really appreciate, I think the design community was pretty well aligned with the city as they were going through this process, because we were getting nervous that some of the kind of artistic objectivity of the architects were being taken out of the hands and put into the hands of the guidelines where it was so prescriptive. So we appreciated that. The guidelines right now are robust enough to protect and have buildings that are kind of compatible, but still giving kind of artistic license to the designers and the professionals that we do with the buildings. So Willkommen. So kind of through that lens of the historic guidelines, we wanted to talk about this project Willkommen, which is German for welcome. To set the context of this isn't just about the historic guidelines, but it's also about affordable housing, which I think everybody in the cities kind of across the country are kind of dealing with issues of how our cities can be affordable, right, in the long term. And that's really what this project was as well. So to set the context, in 2004, the home ownership rate in Over-the-Rhine was 4%. It had suffered from decades of disinvestment. And the slides you see up on the screen were the slides that were pervasive across the entire historic district. There was a lot of vacant buildings. If you kind of look at the image on the right, all of that is vacant, the storefronts. We even had a not-for-profit set up that just painted the storefronts to make them look a little bit better, even though we couldn't get the occupants. It was big issues in 2004. The corporations in Cincinnati and the city came together to say, this is an issue, how do we solve it? And they started a community development corporation called 3CDC. It was started with seed funding from the Procter & Gamble's, the Kroger's, the Macy's, the kind of bigger corporations that had headquarters downtown, because they saw Over-the-Rhine in particular as a real potential asset and something that they could help attract employees, because they're looking for employees to come to the city. This was detracting from employees to come. So how could they solve it? So they started 3CDC with the seed fund. And 3CDC has really been able to kind of, as a community development corporation, tap into alternative financing that typical developers aren't able to. And so they're able to take on projects that have kind of better holistic kind of community good in mind. And they're also, they want to make money too, but they have some other kind of priorities than a typical developer. So kind of early on, 2006, you can kind of see the run. And by the way, I know because Samantha kind of told us this is all very affordable, I think, for New York standards, but it's all relative. So we saw in 2006, the average condo sale price was $195 a square foot. And just, a handful of years with 3CDC kind of doing things like rebuilding our kind of historic park in Over-the-Rhine, which is called Washington Park, building a new park called Ziegler Park, doing a lot of the infrastructure improvements. In addition, the city built a streetcar line. So there was all this kind of investment that was coming into Over-the-Rhine. And the success of that, you saw the prices kind of really kind of skyrocket. So by 2021, those prices for the condos were selling $429 a square foot. So by all accounts, a success. But what it did create was a affordable housing, because the historic people that were in the neighborhood were being forced out of the neighborhood. The home ownership was so low, they weren't able to capitalize on that, and they were being forced into other areas of the city. So we wanted to have a project that came together. So 3CDC, a developer, a for-profit developer called the Model Group, and us, GBBN architects, started looking and brainstorming about how you could have a project that could bring some affordability, which is not an easy issue. And what we came up with was all of these kind of partners you see at the bottom of the screen. Those were all kind of partners that came into building this project. And what we decided was the best fit from a historic perspective that could protect the integrity of the neighborhood, and from a biggest impact standpoint in terms of providing affordable housing, was this scattered site project. So it is scattered kind of around Over-the-Rhine, but it's concentrated in these 4 nodes. Overall, the project is built up of, I think it's 16 historic buildings, 4 infill projects. So a lot of commercial square footage, 163 residential units. Half of those are affordable. We're at 50 to 60% AMI, which is a very affordable rate. The other half are market rate apartments. So anybody kind of in any income bracket can rent those. And pooling those together into all these different buildings was a challenge. But we had these goals from the start that, one, we wanted to provide true mixed income housing that was indistinguishable from the market rate housing in the area. We wanted to use this as another catalyst to kind of connect and develop nodes. That's slide, you see that the projects were really kind of concentrated in these areas. It wasn't fully scattered throughout. We wanted to activate those the vacant blocks. The challenge was in the slide we showed where the demo happened of the kind of individual buildings. It wasn't demo of a big site. It was a really kind of easy development. It was demo of kind of individual sites that all left their foundations. So they're smaller sites, so it was more difficult to make the numbers work with a smaller site. But by kind of pooling these, we wanted to find a way to activate as many of those as you could, so we could really re-stitch the fabric of the neighborhood together. You know, everybody knows those kind of vacant blocks really kind of create a discontinuous neighborhood, and that increased street activity is the kind of final goal. So we started early on back in 2018 to kind of do the outreach and the engagement to see what does the neighborhood want, how do we kind of put this project together. And that's also when we started meeting with the historic staff of the city, to start kind of thinking and brainstorming about this project and what it could be, and kind of go over the goals, and have, I wouldn't say like shared goals, but at least let them know what our goals for the project were. Really quick on financing, because it is a very complicated, this is the most complicated capital stack for any development project I've been a part of. The developers had to access 13 different funding sources in order to kind of put this deal together. It's honestly why a lot of affordable housing projects don't get done, because they become so complicated, because they do need to be subsidized. So we got state historic tax credits, we got federal historic tax credits for the historic renovations. New markets tax credits, opportunity zone equity, all of these different funding sources. What's interesting from an architecture and a development standpoint is that all of these funding sources have different timelines and requirements that you have to hit, and it becomes this kind of complicated web of what the project can be and the timeline it needs to be on to make it happen and really become a driver. That's the capital stack. The other kind of complicated issue with this project was that we had two clients, so the model group, and they became the operator and the owner for all of the residential pieces of the property. 3CDC, which is the Community Development Corporation I mentioned, they became the owner and operator of all of the commercial space. And in order to do that, we actually had to create airlots and split the ownership. So each one of these buildings and each one of these lots has a kind of three-dimensional lot lines that actually separate the ownership. So each individual building has separation. Complications. That was difficult. So for the infill design, first, I mentioned this project has 4 infill projects, but it has all these other historic projects. So these are the kind of before pictures and the after pictures. So it's all of this Italianate architecture that really, this investment helped kind of stabilize vacant buildings or disinvested buildings that were ready to fall down, and really kind of protect the historic fabric we were looking for. But it also included, and this was kind of the important piece to make this deal work, I'm going to talk about 3 of the infill projects that were part of these kind of scattered, each one in a kind of different zone. The infill projects were important from a project standpoint because anybody that's worked with low-income housing tax credits, there's a lot of requirements in terms of exact square footage that you need to hit for the units, exact unit count. All these things that affect your scoring, because it is a competitive scoring in order to get those tax credits, the number of accessible units, all those things are really difficult to achieve in a historic building that doesn't have an elevator, it doesn't have an accessible stoop. So there was a lot that was kind of honestly figured out amongst the historic buildings to say, this is what we can fit in these buildings in terms of unit counts and numbers of 2-bedroom units. And the rest of it is like, how do we get it to work on these sites? So it really became the kind of the variable that we were able to kind of meet those requirements in these 3 buildings and let the other buildings do what they had to do in here's some of the vacant lots. So again, just kind of stitching the fabric back together. I mentioned that we met early on with the city and had a lot of back and forth. So in Cincinnati, the process is that, as was mentioned, but the process is that you submit, the city staff and the historic staff write a report. That report then goes in front of a hearing, which is a historic conservation board, and then the historic conservation board has some guidance from the staff in terms of, but it's up to them to kind of make the recommendation. We're not allowed to meet with the historic conservation board, but we are allowed to meet with the staff, and we work with them throughout the process. So we sit down and kind of set goals. One of the goals for this, we went through the goals that we had, but we also had a client and an architect that really felt strongly about saying, this is a historic district, we're doing a lot of historic rehab, and it's important for us, we feel it's important for the neighborhood to also treat these as contemporary buildings that is looking towards the future of whatever the Rhine can be as well. And so talking through what that meant was an important kind of conversation starting when we were meeting with the city staff. And they were very supportive. So these are the 3 vacant lots. And the first one, so Vine Street, so we kind of said, okay, these are 3 buildings. It's all part of one project, but Over-the-Rhine is not a homogeneous neighborhood. There's a lot of differences in terms of the streets, the different neighborhoods within Over-the-Rhine. We wanted to recognize that. So while we wanted the buildings to be kind of what we said, what we call kind of siblings, they weren't twins, right? So they had a lot of the same kind of language that we used in terms of the palette, but each one was responding to a slightly different context in terms of the immediate street that it was on. For Vine Street, which is a much more kind of commercial street than the other streets, it was important for us to have big, wide open retail. This picture was taken before the retail came in. We'll update that. The other piece of this, you can notice that, like, from a context standpoint, these lots are wider than the surrounding buildings. The typical kind of lot is about 25 feet wide. We're doing much wider development. And one of the key historic guidelines is that the building should feel more vertical than horizontal. So that was a challenge when we're kind of trying to fill in as much of the lot as we can. What we did with this one, and this is something that we kind of worked with the city, is that we used the context around us. There's these historic oriels on the building just down this, off to the left, which is the south, and there's some historic oriels on the building that's right across the street. We said, okay, that is a great historic context, a good reference. Let's use that instead of kind of fakely dividing up the buildings. Let's use that kind of historic language and use that to create a rhythm that helps create some of the verticality. And so we didn't want to replicate the oriels, we wanted to create a contemporary oriel, and so they became these kind of wavy brick, this undulating brick on the front of the facade to create that verticality. Craftsmanship is not what it used to be. Masons are not as skilled masons as they were when Over-the-Rhine was built up 120 years ago. And doing these oriels was a complicated shape, and it was something that we took a lot of pride in saying, let's figure this out. So we had masons in our office. We actually 3D modeled everything and put VR goggles on so that the masons could see brick by brick where they would get laid, and actually use that as a tool on the site. And then we also actually created the 3D files for all the brick ledges so that they had the kind of alignment that they needed. That kind of, I feel like, a lot of the texture and detailing of buildings, this is losing in contemporary architecture because it becomes so expensive to have the good craftsmen that are needed to execute those details. So as a firm, we're very interested in saying, how are we using technology and how are we working a little bit harder so that we are bringing some of that craft and detail back into our buildings. So this is the historic guideline kind of part of the conversation. So for Vine Street, again, as Emily said, we were kind of right in the middle. So when we were meeting with the city, nobody really knew what guidelines we were going to meet. We had to current guidelines, but then we had this draft set of guidelines that we thought was going to be implemented in 6 months. And on top of that, we had all the other project requirements for all of those kind of tax credit and that capital stack that said, we have to be this high because we have to fit this many units. The original guidelines allowed us to be a little bit higher. The proposed guidelines at the time were saying we had to be lower. So it was really this kind of compromise of, you know, where do we need to be? What is appropriate? What is too tall that's going to destroy the historic fabric or compromise the historic fabric? And it was really something that the number of options that we looked at with the city to say, okay, we all feel comfortable with this. That was something that was done pretty early in the process, well before we submitted to the board. Republic Street, this is the second one. And the difference with Republic Street is that it is on a side street. It's much more of a residential street. It's a one-way street that's much narrower. There isn't any kind of commercial fabric on it, but we still wanted to create the kind of activity on the street. So the way it's introduced with this is that we said, okay, instead of a kind of typical multi-family unit where you go in into a corridor and then get into your unit, we wanted to make sure that the front had stoops, so little steps that are lit, that you're walking by, create that kind of activity. There's kind of planter beds. Those kind of little details we think actually goes a long way. So when you are infilling, you're still kind of meeting some of these bigger community goals. Again, all of these projects share the same kind of issue of being really wide. This one we actually kind of brought in some detailing and reveals on the brick detailing to create these kind of more vertical reads of the overall massing. So it's still a very horizontal building. We weren't shying away from that. It's still a pretty contemporary design, but it does still have that kind of historic verticality that is the size and the width of the historic lots. And then the last project is Pleasant Street. So again, back to that kind of height, which is really the kind of biggest issue that I think people were really pushing, that these buildings were too tall. The project did not work financially if they weren't that tall. This is kind of the push and pull of Over-the-Rhine, not every historic district, but a lot of historic districts, and Over-the-Rhine is included in that, need density in order to fight the kind of affordability issue. But going too tall, I completely agree, compromises the historic fabric. So how are we finding that balance? Pleasant Street is on a kind of corner of a very commercial street, Liberty, and Pleasant Street. Pleasant Street kind of leads to our historic market, Findlay Market, and it is a much quieter, again, another one-way, very narrow street. So we wanted to take the massing of this. Again, it's all one building from this line here, over here. How do you step that massing back in a way so that you're still getting the units that required some kind of different detailing of the roof to kind of create a hip through so that we were stepping it down. And then just introducing a little bit of a kink on that kind of front facade so that the shadow hits a difference and you are reading that kind of detail. We thought that was a kind of simple, clean way of detailing some verticality that I think was pretty effective. It's all apartments because it's mixed. It's a mix of low income and market rate apartments. So that's the different tax credits that I listed. Most of those tax credits don't allow you to have for sale product. So it kind of forces your hand into apartments that you utilize like that. We just had Blink, which is our kind of light up festival in downtown. This is not a picture of this year, but Blink was just last weekend. This is a picture of just kind of seeing another view of that activity. Again, these aren't like super high-end condos, but they are detailed in a way, looking at materiality and color, so that these are pretty indistinguishable. Every unit that is market rate is the same exact identical unit that is the affordable housing that was in important for us to kind of have that consistency throughout. And these were leased up before we finished construction. It was very successful from that standpoint. And then community feedback. When we were going through the historic process, it was pretty arduous because there were some pretty vocal groups. There were some pretty vocal groups that were against really any infill. And we had to kind of suss out, okay, which of these comments can we address? How do we address them? And some of them you just can't address. What's been really rewarding on the back end of this, there's a couple comments in here from people that showed up at our historic conservation board meeting as being anti this project. To have them come back around and be really supportive and be using it as a little bit of a model about how we can be doing infill development in Over-the-Rhine has been rewarding to see. And also, I'm not big on awards, but again, having low-income housing tax credit projects win awards is something that happens, but it's rare. And having that kind of that additional lens on it has been something that's been fun for us to be a part of. Challenges, there was many. This project started construction right before COVID. We had a lot of construction challenges. So the initial goal of really kind of joining all of these single sites together into one project and having one construction manager kind of bid on it and being able to kind of have the same person doing the foundation on this project and move without having to completely restage and trying to get some of the cost savings from that. COVID kind of wiped a lot of that out. We had a $1.4 million increase on day one that this project started from just the lumber package because of the way pricing went. But we had to go because the historic tax credit, or not historic, some of the other tax credits that we were getting were really kind of, hey, there's no looking back. We have to keep going. Legal costs because of the intricacy of the financing were exorbitant. So there's some things that I think we could learn from the next one to get a little bit better at. Those were some of the, we were hoping there was going to be more of a benefit in terms of the scale of the overall project that I don't think really got realized. And then I think, we can always do better, and as a firm, we always learn how we can navigate some of the historic concerns. I think for this, we did a lot of meeting with the city. We didn't do as much meeting with some of the groups in the neighborhood at the time, and I think we could have had a bit of an easier process in terms of the actual review of these projects if we had done that outreach. So a little bit of hindsight, that probably would help. Some of these things. So that's it.
First, thank you for coming all the way here, and that was a wonderful presentation, very interesting projects. I could have interrupted you every 10 seconds with a question, but the first one I'd like to ask Emily is the height, you got a very prescriptive height guideline, and then you wanted to simplify it, and you want to be 1 story taller than your neighbor, which just seems really limiting in terms of like creating any sort of density, and couldn't you just have made it you can always be 1 story taller than your neighbor, or you can take your calculator out, which most developers would be willing to do, and do some measurements and get a little, build a little bit bigger. It's always sort of aggravating to try to build up a city when you just can only build 1 story at a time and wait for other buildings to be demolished or fall down.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, a good question. And when we were going through the height analysis, there were a lot of deep dives that were done from different stakeholders. Like, what is going to get you more height? What's going to get us more units? What's more restrictive? And there was a robust debate using real numbers of real sites on which one was better. And ultimately, we were just concerned about the user friendliness of those really strict calculations. That it's asking people to invest a lot before concept or a massing, and that it's hard for staff to really verify or vet. You know, you're really reliant on the applicant saying, this is my regulation, and you kind of have to just accept that at face value. I think we did use the should language here.
That's a good idea.
And so we see, you know, the flexibility of, well, it reads as one story, and we have that discretion because it says it should be one story above or below. So I think it does give us some flexibility there. It's not a hard and fast, you can only, and that's how we interpret it.
Did you consider just having a plain old height limit, like 60 feet?
Well, and we have base zoning regulations that have a standard height limit. So that still is sort of the underlying, you know, if you're way far off, but it looks okay and you're within the permitted height. You know, we still have those to fall back on, but the design guidelines trump the basic height number.
There's a lot of examples of buildings that are hundreds of feet tall next to buildings that are 40 feet tall.
Right.
And very successful. So anyway, that's just, it's an issue we struggle with here.
And I think in Saratoga, we had that standard height, you know, the height limit was, what is it, 60 feet or what, I should know it. But like, it is a result of all of the new construction that was done at a certain time. It's flat roof, all the same height. It didn't allow for variation. So I think, and that's kind of I think was a miss in some respects, that it wasn't flexible enough back when some of the buildings were built here in Saratoga.
There was too much consistency in building.
Yeah, like you look around.
There are successful examples of that too, like Washington D.C. is all
Right.
120 feet.
But you look at Railroad Place, you know, what if there could have been a bit more height, you know, would people feel the same? It's just my personal opinion. But food for thought. Chad?
So you have a district, the Over-the-Rhine district, that has additional land use regulations. What do you do for outreach when people are investing? Because we often get on design review where people saying, if they're in an architectural district or one of our two historic districts, we now, and it's their due diligence to do their research. My day job, I get people who say, we didn't know that the flood map was going to change and we were in a flood zone. Because the realtors will not tell you that. Then what they'll say to you is, just imagine the possibilities without telling you what the constraints are. So do you have some sort of outreach program? Like, I assume you have individual investors who might be trying to rehab a historic structure or maybe build the house of their dreams in that district. It's like, then they didn't know they could use certain materials. They couldn't use between glass light dividers, which should be banned everywhere. But you know, I'm sure it's in, as you said, that's in your guidelines as a must. So what do you do for that disconnect? And then when they come into your land use boards and complain that, you know, if they had been in a different district in the city, they'd be able to do whatever they wanted to.
Well, you know, one thing I can say is, you know, and I don't know what New York State regulations are. In Ohio, that you're in a historic district is one of the required real estate disclosures, but people don't always read their real estate disclosures, and we get plenty of people that buy properties that don't know. We try and do a lot of, from a staff level, we do regular like realtor organization trainings. We have 52 neighborhoods in the city, and they have one sort of unifying community council organization. We do a lot of outreach through them, sort of historic district 101, zoning 101 trainings, trying to get the word out more. But we also have a very sort of robust pre-development process where sort of, I would say that the historic staff has a very open door policy. Anyone sends us a question, anyone wants to schedule a meeting, we schedule meetings. We want to talk to clients early and often, and we try and get the word out that, like, you can come to us without anything fully formed. Like, we want you to come to us without anything fully formed and talk through the concept so we can give you that early feedback.
So when they're signing, they're buying a house, and the realtors are rushing, they got to get a fee. And so when you sign 20 different documents, sign here, sign here, sign here, sign here, let me think, the flood zone, and blah, 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 blah. There's something there that about the zoning and the code regulations.
Yes, about the historic regulations.
Okay, fair enough.
Any other?
we work with the law department. We take a very hard line that the guidelines or the zoning code is not the code until it's adopted. You're reviewed under the code you apply for your permit on, or you apply for the hearing, and there's really no flexibility on that. Out of fairness, right? This is the date the code goes into effect, and this is what applies to your project. That doesn't keep people, as we saw with this project, doesn't keep people from coming out and saying this is wrong because it doesn't meet the new guidelines. But it's our very clear policy interpretation. But I think we also take the viewpoint that we made code changes for a reason, and so saying that your neighbor is set back 30 feet and the new regulations are 0, yes, maybe there's flexibility if it makes the streetscape, wonky because of the differing setbacks, but we take that as, the direction is not to match that 30, previous regulation. The direction is that the new construction is better. It meets the new policy goals. So we do take a pretty hard line with that because the policy was recently changed. Our policymakers made that decision. So we take that as our direction.
Abby, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I was just curious, is it all full now? Like, are they all occupied?
Oh, yeah, this project was fully leased up before construction. So it was a success. Now, there's still 2 commercial spaces that are yet to be leased. Those take a little bit longer because they have to find the right operator. It's, a restaurant that's not going to fail after the first year. It takes some time.
And they're all rentals, correct?
Yes.
They couldn't, like here in New York State, we can do, condos that can be purchased using tax credits. So that's not an option there? Yeah, like that's how Putnam project is being.
We typically have to let the tax credits expire.
They're doing some special financing for the project.
Yeah, I think after 7 years we could, but because of the low income piece of this as well, they're going to remain terms.
Which project are you?
Putnam, right across from the library. 53 Putnam. Those are going to
Oh,
be
they're
occupied. And there's no like inclusionary zoning or any rezoning that was done.
No, not for us.
We recently had a big zoning reform policy change go through in the city, and the decision was to allow bonuses for low-income housing tax credit projects, so that there was no maximum density, no parking requirement, and you get an extra 12 feet of height if you're using a low-income housing tax credit funding.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So I have a question. How did you put in the heating and cooling? Is it based on some new technologies, or did you use electric, natural gas, conventional, whatever?
Well, each of these, they're electrical, typical kind of condenser units. So there are condenser units on the rooftops of all of these.
Every unit has their own. And then the second question is, how can we encourage more young people to get to be expert masons?
I don't know the answer to that. Do you? Yeah.
No, I know. I mean, I'm the chair of the National Preservation Partners Network, which is a group of 130 preservation organizations across the country. And affordable housing, climate, and DEI, the trades workforce, is one of the top 4 priorities, because we are losing the people to do the work that we need, whether it's for new construction or actually historic trades. But it's a real need, and it's been a hard nut to crack. But we're trying to get the word out that you can make a good living and be successful by joining a trade, but it's going to take time and work. But yeah, it's a national issue.
And I'll add, Covington, Kentucky, right across the river from us, took almost, I'd say, 7 years of planning to get a historic preservation trades academy off the ground. And really, once they finally got the funding and the teachers and the facility, they're struggling right now to get people to enroll in it. So they see a lot of homeowners that want to do it for weekend projects, but actually that's not the goal. And so they're really going back to the drawing board to see how can they, get this as a job creation center.
Michelle, you're next.
I'm just curious, as you work through this project, just more information during this, I'm just curious, it may be too early to tell, but are you seeing it start to spread in any areas in this area of the city? Like you?
Yeah, so, absolutely. I mean, I encourage everybody to come to Over-the-Rhine. You will enjoy it, love it. There's like our historic theaters, and it is right now a thriving area. A lot of that thriving was happening kind of, Liberty Street is kind of the bisector that goes east-west, and a lot of that thriving was happening kind of south. And I think that this project and phase 2, which is kind of currently under construction, is really kind of bridging that. And so we're seeing a lot more just coming to the kind of area that's in the
That was actually kind of a question, is there a next phase or a long-term plan, like periods forward?
There is an next phase. I mean, this wouldn't happen if we didn't have the 3CDC and Model Group, which Model Group is a for-profit developer, but they specialize in these kind of complicated tax credit deals, which not every developer wants to take on. But the 3CDC partnership with them is really kind of, because they're taking all the risk. I mean, the housing, that will turn a profit all day. The commercial space is very risky because you have a lot of turnover there, and it's difficult to get financing. For them to kind of take on all of that, and the streetscape piece really is kind of what makes this deal go. So that is happening. There is a phase 2. It's the it took a few years to kind of, because I think it was just such a complicated to get this first one done. It took a few years of like, let's do an easy one, and then, but they've re-engaged phase 2.
Sure. So I'm originally from Rochester, New York.
Okay.
And so I go back home like twice a year just to see what's going on, see friends and whatnot. But they're doing a similar type thing that Cincinnati's doing, taking what's, downtown has been disinvested in for the last 30 years, and buildings are just set vacant, and then, corporations have left, so they're basically taking commercial space and turning it residential, taking abandoned buildings and making urban housing. So there's a slow but great transformation going on.
Yeah.
So it's very encouraging.
Any other questions?
First of all, congrats on the presentation. I thought it was well done. I also want to compliment you. You were talking about the staff in terms of going through each application, and then you generate a list of items that you then give to probably the planning board. I was curious, that process, if you could summarize it, how long does it take for an applicant who comes in with a project that's, pretty viable and realistic to get that response back and move forward?
We'll get both perspectives. Yeah. I may have a nicer perspective than Chad's having. I mean, I can start and say we do a lot of pre-work. So before things are fully ready to submit, we're doing virtual meetings, we're doing in-person meetings to kind of get feedback, because our goal as staff is to always get to a project that we can recommend approval of before it goes to the board, or to have the applicant know going in, these are issues, so they've had the opportunity to address them, and then they can take their chances. That's why we have a public process. But once you actually have an application ready at the end of the process, it's about a 2-month process. From when you submit that application, Our law department does the intake of the application, make sure it's complete. They send it to our department. Our staff prepares a staff report, details our recommendation, our analysis according to the design guidelines. That gets transmitted to the board and to the public about a week and a half, at least a week before the hearing. So there's time for everyone to review it. We have a hard deadline on public comment and applicant updated revisions just to keep that process smooth and to give everyone enough time to review the documents before the hearing.
So, I think that's all totally like everything Lisa. We know before that staff report is written how it's going to be written, because there have been the kind of transparency of meetings that happen beforehand to be blunt and address some things. And then it's up to us and the owner to decide if there's things that we feel strongly about that are maybe objected to, and present those to the board and see if we can kind of get that approved. The board doesn't always take every recommendation that they look at it and make their decision. The process right now is it 6 weeks when you submit and then it's a meeting? So it's a 6-week process to submit all of the material. After you've had your meetings, you get all the material together, you submit it, and then it's 6 weeks to have a community outreach meeting, a staff report written, and to get the meeting on the hearing calendar. So 6 weeks is pretty fast, I think, for all of that to happen. It is 6 weeks where you don't know. Your project is a little bit in limbo, but it's relatively quick.
So it's probably that quick because the communication works well, and you were open to those applicants and communicating. Could I assume that?
I think that's definitely.
And I think it's something that we kind of get complaints on both sides of it, right? People say there's not enough time to really, neighbors, community councils say there's not enough time to really review a project, but then, time is money to developers, so this is kind of our compromise timeline. But the one thing that Chad mentioned that I forgot is we do have what's called a public staff conference, and that happens before our report is written, and that's an opportunity for anyone that gets the public notice, gets the link to that virtual meeting. They can get feedback, the applicant attends it. Sometimes no one shows up, sometimes it's just staff and the applicant kind of waiting to see if anyone shows up, and sometimes we get really robust public comment in advance, and that helps the applicant too know kind of what to expect at the hearing.
I compliment you on the process.
And is it something where you could submit like a schematic design or possible design development stage of drawings to be able to, with listing of materials and things like that, correct?
Yeah, you don't have to have full construction document ready plans. Yep.
Once you get through that, how long does the permit take? Since it's been the permit lead time.
Well, when we are ready, so we get that, we get the comments, we get the approval from the Historic Conservation Board, then we get moving on the actual documents, because we're not taking the risk of doing a whole construction.
But once you do submit the permit.
Once we do submit the permit, it's probably 2 months, month and a half.
Nice.
The review goals are, get a response within 3 weeks for a commercial project, 2 weeks for a residential project, and then 5 days for each revision. But that's a response from each reviewer.
4 months.
Have you met? You should meet with our building department to see if you can learn anything.
Yeah. How long does your permit take?
You don't want to know.
19 weeks. Up to 9 months.
19 weeks.
16 is what I heard.
19.
19.
I'm not.
And that's not a bad thing to think we're on. It's something.
Just a climb. 19 weeks if we need it. It's a complicated issue, but anyways. I'd like to ask a question.
Isn't that 5
I know
months?
this woman here was waiting.
Yes, you're next.
Okay, just had a quick question about how you
They say happy
actually
year.
accomplish the public notification for the adjacent property owners when there's a project, if that's done through a legal notice, if you do something more, in terms of outreach to inform them that you're getting the process?
Yeah, our law department does the notice process. They mail a postcard, that's the formal legal notice. It is also published in what's called the city bulletin, so anyone that just wanted to monitor hearings can see it there. A notice goes, we have a community council system in the city, so a notice goes if there's a community council or a community development corporation for the neighborhood, a notice goes to them with the public notice to the neighbors. And then the packet is posted on the city's website so that anyone that just wanted to see what's on, anyone can sign up to be on the agenda for the Historic Conservation Board, and just every time an agenda is issued, you'll get that email notice. So those are the various pieces.
Steve does. Oh, and then Chris, sorry. You probably Steve.
Sort of a continuation of the same topic. So those meetings with a public comment, is that basically scheduled as needed, or is that really tied to the board hearing schedule?
Well, the official public staff conference, that's a regular schedule. I think it's 2 weeks before the hearing is when that's, I don't know if that's the exact date, but it's a prescribed monthly time in advance of each hearing.
Yeah, I'm going to change things up a little bit. How do you, as you're growing, lots of people, how are you dealing with pedestrian continuity, bike paths, parking, traffic, mass transit? Saratoga is disjointed. It's a great walking city in different areas, but it's not cohesive. So is that part of your planning process when you're doing projects? Is that part of the process?
Our projects, I mean, those kind of conversations are happening, not on the individual projects level, but they're happening kind of at a bigger city level. So we've done a lot. Cincinnati at one point changed all of their streets to one-way streets in opposite directions. Not everyone, but a lot of them downtown, which I think studies show that that's not great for traffic flow and for retail activity. Some of those streets have been changed. There's plans for others to be changed back into two-way. That's one thing. We've had some street calming, is I think the term, traffic calming measures where we're taking out lanes of traffic. Again, correcting some of the sins of the past planning. To really kind of, so Liberty Street went from, I think, 7 lanes to 5 lanes just a couple years ago, which was with medians in between to help. So there are those conversations. I think we can have a lot more.
So it's at this point, it's still almost an afterthought. It's still part of your process, but it's not being pushed heavily. It's
not being pushed by the individual projects, because at the individual project level, we're meeting the standards that the city is setting for the streetscape.
Right.
But the city is having bigger level conversations about what that streetscape is that we then the individual project.
And I'll say particularly in Over-the-Rhine, there has been a very robust ongoing conversation about parking, and there's a lot of competing parking needs from business owners or Finley Market that needs people to be able to come down on the weekends and quickly and easily park near them, to residents that need a close, accessible place to their historic home that has no off-street parking. And so I think the city has really tried to be open to readjusting, things like the on-street parking, and if that's paid or if that's resident only, and really kind of continue. I mean, it's a work in progress, but I think really being open to continuously reevaluating what the parking needs are in different parts of the neighborhood as it grows.
We keep talking about parking, but I'm talking more about bike paths and walkability and more about that type of vibrant sort of city.
Yeah.
Those are really important things. It just seems to me we're still a car-centric country. We got to break that model. I don't see it happening quick enough, in my opinion. But in a historic district, that's a really wonderful thing. Walking in the city of Saratoga is great, but it's still not cohesive. It's still broken up, and that's a real problem.
I think we implemented the streetcar. We do have several things we could we implemented the streetcar project. It's been in it now for maybe even longer, geez. And it's had its ebbs and flows. Honestly, this is my personal opinion, that to have things like that be a success, parking needs to be a little bit more painful. It needs to be more painful to drive. And right now, we're still living on streets that were designed, decades ago for really high-speed traffic, and we need to kind of remedy some of those things to slow the traffic down, and that would make it a little bit more painful to drive and really kind of incentivize the bike, pedestrian, and mass transit options that are there. I don't have this.
I'm going to take one last question, and then others want to come up afterwards and talk to them.
I was just curious, based off of, you mentioned the Italian 8 streetscapes and the older buildings, based off of going through those, and whether it's materials, workmanship, what most impresses you about some of those older structures looking back on it?
Oh, for me, it's the craftsmanship and the detailing that you see. You've got all of these, different cornices and the tin dockers that went and shaped all those cornices, and they're still in fantastic shape. And the brickwork, and the detailing, and the stonework. I mean, it's just amazing. You can walk by a building, 100 times, and you're still finding new details about it. That's the stuff that is just not everybody, but we don't see as much of that in today's architecture.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thoughtful discussion, great questions.